Hello, and welcome to Lesson 13, in which we will discuss Islam. Now, the majority of this lecture is going to be reading straight from the book, and that's because most of the beginning of the Islam chapter is historical accounts that actually warrant a direct read. Therefore, those who have finished the reading before listening to this lecture will find most of the content to be a review. Still, our focus within this historical content is to try to discover the ideologies and the theological concepts that come from the historical accounts. So this lecture is going to start off with background and history, really going over what Islam means and kind of the conquest of the Arabs. And then we're going to move into what is understood as the seal of the prophets, or how Muhammad is considered the seal of the prophets. And then a discussion on the night of power. Then we're going to move on to the migration from Mecca that led to victory. Then go into what is understood as the standing miracle for Islam, the words of the Quran, some basic theological concepts of God, creation, and then finally the Day of Judgment, of which will end this lecture, right before the 5 pillars. So it is in the latter portion of this lecture where we really get into the philosophy of Islam. That's not to say we're not going to get into philosophy throughout, but as I discussed earlier, most of it is just direct historical accounts that require a direct read. And it is with that understanding we now turn towards background and history. So this chapter starts off with a lesson in geography, basically saying that of all the non-Western religions, Islam stands closest to the West. No part of the world is more hopelessly and systematically and stubbornly misunderstood by us than that complex of religion, culture, and geography known as Islam. To which they say proximity is no guarantee of concord. This means that just because you are close to them doesn't mean that closeness is going to promote understanding. Islam and the West are neighbors. And because of that, border disputes arose, beginning with raids and counter-raids, which escalated into vendettas. We know this. We know of the issues of the West and Islam. But we get into some mistakes here that are often associated with Islam. And the first is, until recently, it was called Mohammedanism. Now, this term is not only inaccurate, it's actually considered offensive. Because as Muslims state, Muhammad didn't create the religion, God did. Muhammad is merely the prophet, God's mouthpiece. As we will see much more later in the discussion, that the religion of Islam focuses highly on separating the idea of the divine and the mortal. So this title, this term of Mohammedanism, kind of goes against that whole ideology of separating the divine and man. Now, Christianity is called Christianity because it came from Christ, and Christians believed that Christ was of the God substance. So after that distinction, we can get into kind of the proper name of this religion, which is Islam. And Islam, which is derived from the root salam, which means peace, also means in its secondary sense to surrender. Its full connotation is the peace that comes when one's life is surrendered to God. So that is the proper name of the religion and the correct connotation of which the religion wants to promote. Now, with that understanding, we can move on kind of to the history of the Arabs. Now, the Arabs were masters of an empire extending from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to the confines of China, an empire that was greater than Rome in its zenith. And central to this rise was their religion. But to move to the beginnings does not lead us to Muhammad in the 6th century, but rather to God. As Genesis tells us, in the beginning, God. The Quran agrees, but uses the word Allah formed by joining the definitive article al, meaning the, with la, which is God, literally meaning the God, Allah. God created the world, then human beings, and of the first was Adam. Adam's descendants led to Noah, who had son Shem, of which the term Semite comes from. Like Jews, the Arabs consider themselves a Semitic people. Descendants of Shem led to Abraham. And it's good to note that so far we are still within the traditions and wisdoms of Judaism and Christianity. But what seemed to provide Islam with its name, and is a very strong consideration when it comes to Islam as a whole, was the submission of Abraham in his supreme test. Would he be willing to sacrifice his son? For those who don't know, Abraham had a wife, Sarah, who had a son named Isaac. And one day, God came down and told Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Abraham, of course, didn't want to do this, but also didn't want to disobey God. Thus went up into a mountain to sacrifice his son, and before he did, God intervened and said that the sacrifice would not be necessary, as it was a test to see if Abraham would obey God. So that's the accounts that really provide Islam with its name, to surrender. This is the kind of surrendering they mean here. But the story before Sarah had Isaac provides the origin stories for the Muslims, which is where the divergence takes place between the Quran and the biblical accounts. So Abraham, who married Sarah, at first had a very difficult time conceiving a son. So Abraham, wanting to continue his line, took on a second wife, and her name was Hajar. And she bore him a son called Ishmael. But then Sarah conceived a son named Isaac, and then ordered Abraham to banish both Ishmael and Hajar from the tribe. And now is where we come to the divergence. And in the Quran, Ishmael went to the place where Mecca was to rise, and his descendants flourished in Arabia to become the Muslims, where those of Isaac who remained in Palestine were Hebrews and then became Jews. And what's necessary here for our understanding is how it is highlighted that the Quran isn't set alone. It actually comes from or continues the Old and New Testament. It is not a separate ideology or a separate historical account whatsoever, like that of Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism. Its religious-based historical accounts are very much intermingled with Judaism and Christianity. And with that understanding, we can now move on to the section, the Seal of the Prophets. Now it is from here that we follow Ishmael's line in Arabia and come to the latter half of the 6th century AD to Muhammad, who is called the Seal of the Prophets because of the belief that no valid prophets will follow him. So for the theology of Islam, Muhammad is the last and culminating prophet. There are to be no prophets after him. That is what is meant by the Seal of the Prophets. But now let's move on to a little history of Muhammad himself. He was born into a world summed up by one word: ignorance. The Muslims felt no obligation to anyone outside their tribes, and as a result, there was a political deadlock, and the collapse of the magistrate in the leading city of Mecca aggravated the chaotic situations. So what we have here, it's almost like a warring states period of Confucianism. But to add to this chaos was a prevailing religion described as an animistic polytheism. And what this means is beastly spirits called jinn or demons, which inspired neither exalted sentiments nor moral restraint, were worshipped. And it was into these circumstances that Muhammad was born into, a leading tribe of Mecca, the Quraysh, in approximately 570 AD. His father died a few days before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. His grandfather, who had taken him in after his mom died, ended up dying when he was 8. He was then adopted by his uncle, and he worked hard minding his uncle's flock, and he was warmly received. It was as if the angels of God had opened up and filled Muhammad's heart with light. This kind of epitomized his character as a pure-hearted and beloved individual who was both sweet and gentle in disposition. His bereavements had made him sensitive to human suffering in every form, always ready to help others. A motivation that would convene on him titles such as the true, the upright, and the trustworthy one. But the frequent quarreling and cynicism and general immorality combined to produce in the prophet to be a reaction of horror and disgust. So what was going on during his time produced in him a disgust, but also at the same time he had a motivation to go out and help and be a guiding light. At 25, he entered the service of a wealthy widow named Khadijah. This relationship ended up turning romantic, and they were married even though she was 15 years his senior. And yet this was seen as God comforting him through her. Now, while preparing or going through 15 years of preparation for his ministry, Muhammad would start to frequent a cave in a mountain on the outskirts of Mecca, known as Mount Hira. And as Houston Smith states, the desert jinn were irrelevant to this quest, but one deity was not. And that deity's name was Allah. Now, Allah was worshipped by Meccans, not only as a god, but as an impressive one. Allah, Muhammad was convinced, was far greater, though, than his countrymen supposed. This God, whose majesty overflowed a desert cave to fill all heaven and earth, was the God. And it is in this cave that we now move forward to the Night of Power. The Night of Power describes an event that happened in the cave of Mount Hira, where Muhammad was practically given the same command that had fallen earlier on Abraham, Moses, Samuel, Isaiah, and Jesus. And that command was, "You are the appointed one." On the first night of power, as Muhammad lay on the floor of the cave, his mind locked in deep contemplation, there came to him an angel in the form of a man. The angel said, "Proclaim," and Muhammad declined 3 times. All stating, "I am not the proclaimer." Every time the angel took him in an embrace, and on the 3rd time said, "Proclaim in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Proclaim, your Lord is the most generous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man what he knew not." Quran 96, 1-3. This terrified him, and he rushed home to Khadijah, saying he had become a prophet or one possessed. Now, at first she resisted, but eventually upon hearing the story, believed him and became his first convert. Muslims would later remark this speaks to his authenticity, for if anyone understands a man's true character, it is his wife. Thus, Muhammad would repeatedly return to the cave, and the angel's command was always the same, to proclaim, and Muhammad's life was no longer his own. From that time forth, it was given to God and to humanity, preaching with unswerving purpose in the face of relentless persecution, insult, and outrage, the words that God was to transmit for 23 years. And the words that were transcribed would become known as the Quran. But there's a clear distinction here that Muhammad was not a miracle worker, merely a preacher. He refused to pander to the human credulity of the time where supernaturalism and miracles were accepted. So basically at this time, there was this idea that unless you worked a miracle, unless you showed something supernatural, that it wouldn't be taken seriously as being divine. Now, Muhammad, he never took the bait, per se, stating that God has not sent me to work wonders. He has sent me to preach to you. My Lord be praised. Am I more than a man sent as an apostle? So he asks the question that he wants others to answer as no, he's just merely God's mouthpiece. He is no more than a man. Stating further that I have never said that God's treasures are in my hand, that I know the hidden things, or that I was an angel. I am only a preacher of God's words, the bringer of God's message to mankind. Now, the reason for this constant focus is because this is important to the understanding of Islam. We need to understand that Muhammad does not declare himself to be more than simply a messenger. So the focus here is on God's majesty, God's greatness, citing the creation of things as God's creations. This brought out an admiration and respect for the world's order, a respect that would bring Muslims to science before it did Christians. Altogether claiming only one miracle had happened, that of the Quran itself, that Muhammad, with his own resources, could have produced such a truth was something he could not accept. That is something we will delve deeper into later on in the lecture. As for now, we're going to focus on the reaction to the message. And the reaction to this message was outright hostility. And according to Huston Smith, there are three prominent reasons for this hostility. One, the message that was being preached was uncompromising monotheism, which threatened the polytheistic beliefs and the considerable revenue that was coming to Mecca from pilgrimage to its 360 shrines, one for every day of the lunar year. So the monotheism that Muhammad was preaching threatened the polytheistic beliefs of the time. And these polytheistic beliefs had created extreme revenue, a lot of money coming to Mecca from the pilgrimages. And as you can imagine, the leaders of Mecca would not give up such a revenue so easily. Now, the second reason for such all-out hostility was because the moral teachings demanded an end to the licentiousness that citizens clung to. That is to say that they enjoyed the sinful and lustful ways that the jinn had permitted. And the third reason for this all-out hostility was its social content challenged the unjust order of the time. In a society with class distinctions, the new prophet was preaching a message that was intensely democratic, insisting in sight of his Lord all people were equal. And now the Meccan leaders attacked Muhammad with ridicule, insults, and derision, which eventually led, when it didn't work, to abuse, calamity, and vilification. And even then, when that didn't work, overt threats and open persecution. Yet all of these tactics did not have the effect that they had intended, for it only steeled the will of Muhammad's followers, and for Muhammad, under the most perilous of circumstances, continued to throw heart and soul into his preachings. Eventually, several hundred families were acclaiming him as God's authentic spokesman, which leads us to the inevitability of his migration. So what had begun as a pretentious prophetic claim on the part of a half-crazed camel driver had turned into a serious revolutionary movement that was threatening the Mecca nobility's very existence. Thus they were determined to rid themselves of the troublemaker for good. But by this time, Muhammad did have other places to turn to, because Muhammad was suddenly waited on by the delegation of the leading citizens of Yathrib. This was because Muhammad's teachings had won him a firm hold in Yathrib, but the city was facing internal rivalries that put it in need of a strong leader from without. That is to say, they were looking for leadership outside of Yathrib, and Muhammad was their man. After the people accepted the pledge that they would worship Allah only, that they would observe the precepts of Islam and obey its prophet in all that was right and defend him, Muhammad would then receive a sign from God to accept the charge, to accept the leadership in Yathrib. But when the Meccan leaders caught wind of this exodus, they tried to stop Muhammad and his close companion Abu Bakr, but they eluded them and made for Yathrib. In the year 622, the migration, known in Arabic as Hijra, is regarded by Muslims as a turning point in world history, and is the year from which they date their calendar. Yathrib soon came to be known as Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, and then simply to Medina, the city. But Muhammad would not remain a prophet. He was pressed to go from prophet into administration and ended up becoming a masterful politician, transforming into also a remarkable statesman, continued to become the supreme magistrate while continuing to live the unpretentious life that he had in the days of his obscurity. His administration is depicted by tradition as an ideal blend of justice and mercy, meting out punishment to the guilty, but gentle and merciful when the injury was towards himself. His personal history merged with that of the Medinese Commonwealth, eventually welding the 5 conflicting tribes of the city. In the end, he succeeded in awakening in the city a spirit of cooperation unknown in the city's history. And now, with a united city and a powerful message, the city of Medina would begin its conquest of Mecca. Now, Mecca struggled to main the mind of Arabia. That is to say, they struggled to ideologically appeal to the mind of Arabia, or what was becoming the ideology of Arabia. Now, in the second year of the Hijra, and the Hijra is the migration of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina, the Medinese had won a spectacular victory over a Meccan army many times their size, which was interpreted as a clear sign that the angels of heaven were on their side. And again, since this was the second year of the migration, it was known that he was heading to Medina. This did even more to the claim that they were in divine favor. Muhammad, however, was wounded the following year, yet the Meccan army did not follow up their victory until 2 years later, when they laid siege to Medina, but failed to make the Muslims capitulate, which would permanently turn the tide in Muhammad's favor. Within 3 years, 8 years after his migration from Mecca, after leaving a fugitive, he would return a conqueror. Yet Muhammad would not press his victory, but rather in his hour of triumph, the past was forgiven. Rededicating the famous Kaaba temple to Allah and accepting the virtual mass conversion of the city, he then returned to Medina. And in 632 AD, Muhammad died with virtually all of Arabia under his control. And before the century's close, his followers have conquered Armenia, Persia, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, North Africa, and Spain. And as Houston Smith states, but for their defeat by Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours in 1733, the entire Western world might today be Muslim. And in the 100, a ranking of the most influential persons in history, Michael Hart places Muhammad first. His unparalleled combination of secular and religious influence entitles Muhammad to be considered the most influential single figure in human history, Hart would write. Now, with that understanding of Muhammad and historically where he came from and his triumphs, we can lead now to more of the philosophy of Islam. And with that philosophy, we will start with the standing miracle. Now, Muslims see Muhammad as a man who experienced life in exceptional range, as he was an orphan, shepherd, merchant, hermit, exile, soldier, lawmaker, prophet, priest, king, and mystic. Also, for many years, the husband of one wife, much older than himself, a many times bereaved father, a widower, and finally, the husband of many wives, some much younger than himself. Thus, he was considered a man of exceptional range. But regardless of this exceptional range and life of Muhammad, the Muslims never mistook him for the earthly centers of their faith. That place is reserved for the Bible of Islam, the Quran. That is to say, that they never mistook him as divine or of divine substance or even the center of the faith of Islam itself. That center was reserved for the Quran. Literally coming from the word in Arabic, al-Quran, meaning a recitation. So great was Muhammad's regards for the Quran's contents that he considered it the only major miracle God worked through him, God's standing miracle, as he called it. For Muhammad himself was unschooled and unlettered and could barely write his name. Thus, to produce a book that provides the ground plan of all knowledge and at the same time is grammatically perfect and without poetic peer, he and the Muslims are convinced defies belief. And the Quran itself is divided into 114 chapters called the surahs, which are arranged in order of decreasing length. Now, the Muslims tend to read the Quran literally. They see its earthly facsimile, that is to say, what was created from the time in the cave, as an uncreated Quran in exactly the same way that the Christians consider Jesus to have been the human incarnate of God. That's not to say that there are two Qurans. Rather, the created Quran is the formal crystallization of the infinite reality of the uncreated Quran, which adds to the fact that Muhammad was merely the voice box of God. So the uncreated form was that only God had access to. Thus, the created Quran is the instantiation in letters and sounds of the Quran's limitless essence in its uncreated form. This communicates two levels of reality that are operating here. You have this divine reality where the uncreated Quran exists. And then there is this earthly reality in which the created Quran resides. So when the created Quran is said to be a miracle, the miracle refers to the presence of the uncreated Quran within the letters and sounds of its created manifestation. So the limitless ability to decipher meaning comes from this uncreated source, which we have access to from the created. What is trying to be communicated here is the limitless potential of the divine uncreated, which we have access to from the words and sounds of the created. Emphasis here on the sounds as we lead to the words of the Quran. So the words of the Quran came to Muhammad in manageable segments over 23 years through a voice that seemed at first to vary and sometimes sounded like the reverberating of bells, but gradually condensed into a single voice that identifies itself as Gabriel. Now, for our purposes, it's very important to note the musical elements to the description, as the emphasis in Islam is not only the words, but the communication of feelings associated with those words. Feelings that we can identify through music. You know how when you listen to a song and it affects your emotions, that's kind of what is being hinted at here. As Muhammad reported that the words assaulted him, as if they were solid and heavy. For we shall charge thee with a word of weight, 73:5 of the Quran. And Houston Smith points out that all such references in this chapter are to the sutras and verses in the Quran. There is also an example given of the type of weight they're talking about, because these words once descended upon Muhammad while riding a camel, and the animal sought in vainly to support the added weight by adjusting its feet, but by the time the revelation ceased, its belly was pressed on the ground. So the words of Muhammad explained were memorized by his followers and recorded on bones, bark, leaves, and scraps of parchment, with God preserving their authenticity throughout. And the words that were preserved, that would become the Quran, is known to continue the Old and New Testament, God's earlier revelations, and presents itself as their culmination. We made a covenant of old with the children of Israel, and you have nothing of guidance until you observe the Torah and the Gospels. 570 and 68. So the idea here is that they're a culmination because they are continuing where the Old and New Testament left off. And they pay tribute to those works by stating that you will not understand anything that has gone on now in the Quran until you read and acquire the knowledge from those past wisdoms, the Torah and the Gospels. So again, this culmination works hand in hand with Muhammad's name of being a seal of the prophets. This is the final word and basically the last chapter, for lack of a better word. And thus no other prophet will come after Muhammad, and there's no more that needs to be added to the works of the Old and New Testament, for the Quran takes over where they left off. However, even though the Quran continues the Old and New Testament, it does not mean they believe everything that is found in the Old and New Testament. Now, the big discrepancies we will go over later on in the lecture, but there are some that are shared here. For example, the Jewish and Christian Bible were thought of as partially corrupted in transmission, which is a fact that explains the occasional discrepancies that occur between their account and the parallel ones in the Quran. One that comes to mind immediately is the travels of Ishmael after the banishment of him and his mother Hajar. See, the Muslims see the Quran as the final and infallible revelation of God's will. Its second chapter says it explicitly. This is the scripture whereof there is no doubt. But I want to transition here into kind of like the language barrier of the Quran and leave the compare and contrast for the latter portion of this lecture. Houston Smith states it explicitly. From without, the Quran is all but impenetrable. Carlyle confesses that it was as toilsome reading as I ever undertook. A wearisome, confused jumble, crude, incondite. Nothing but a sense of duty can carry a European through the Quran. But the language in which the Quran was proclaimed, Arabic, provides an initial clue to this impenetrability. No people in the world, writes Philip Haydee, are so moved by the word, spoken or written, as the Arabs. Hardly any language seems capable of exercising over the mind of its users such irresistible influence as Arabic. Can be stirred to the highest emotional pitch by statements that, when translated, seem banal. And this is because the Quran was from the first a vocal phenomenon. We remember that we are to recite in the name of the Lord. This is why, in sharp contrast to Christians who have translated their Bible into every known script, Muslims have preferred to teach others the language in which they believe God spoke. So there's an undertone here of not only words, but words that elicit feelings, poetry almost. Words that have the power to elicit the destruction of the ignorant and the elevation of the enlightened. In addition to language barriers, there are also content barriers, because the Quran is not explicitly metaphysical. It does not ground its theology in dramatic nor historical narratives. God is not revealed in human form, so there is no attempt to make God understandable by bringing him to the material plane. And if we confine ourselves to only the Semitic scriptures, we can say, whereas the Old and New Testaments are directly historical and indirectly doctrinal, the Quran is directly doctrinal and indirectly historical. And that is because the overwhelming thrust of the Quran is to proclaim the unity, omnipotence, omniscience, and mercy of God, and correlatively, the total dependence of human life upon him. So historical facts are in this case merely reference points that have scarcely any interest in themselves, which means it's more about God's power and knowledge and majesty as opposed to historical accounts, which, as you can imagine, is a strong contrast between the Old and New Testament and the Quran. And there are scriptures that pose problems for Muslims. Speaking of only the Old and New Testament, the Muslims say that those texts do not take the form of divine speech and merely report things that happened. In the Quran, God speaks in the first person. Allah describes himself and makes known his laws. By contrast, the Jewish and Christian Bibles seem more distant from God, for placing religious meaning in reports of events instead of God's direct pronouncements. That is to say that they talk about historical activities and historical accounts that happened and then say that God was working through those individuals instead of having God's words being spoken. That's what's being contrasted here. And the central position of the Quran is that it is a memorandum for the faithful, a reminder for daily doings, and a repository of revealed truth. Which leads us to one of the final sections in this segment, in which we compare and contrast theological concepts. The basic theological concepts that we're going to focus on is God, creation, the human self, and the day of judgment. Now, concerning God, just as in other historical religions, everything in Islam centers on its religious ultimate God. Conceptually, the God closely resembles the God of the Jews and the God of the Christians, for their God is immaterial and therefore invisible. This is something of which the Arabs cast no doubt. The Arabs, however, never succumbed to the temptation to regard only the visible as the real. Because if you think about it, they are desert dwellers. And often in the desert, it's as if invisible hands are shaping the sands. And distant mirages can produce something that looks real but isn't there. So the Quran didn't introduce the Arabs to the unseen world, nor monotheism, since certain souls known as the Hanifs had already moved to that position before Muhammad. Where the Quran differed, and as Houston Smith states, what is Quran's innovation, was to remove idols from the religious scene and focus the divine into a single, invisible God for everyone. And it is in this sense where the monotheism was most powerful. Or rather, this is where the big contribution came from monotheism, to take down other idols. Which, if you remember, is one of the intolerable aspects of this preaching from Muhammad that the Meccan leaders could not abide by. The fact that it took out their polytheism and the contributions from the polytheism. And it is a contribution that the Muslims see as Islam's contribution to religion in its entirety. Which brings us to a compare and contrast with Christianity. Islam honors Jesus as a prophet and accepts his virgin birth. Adam and Jesus' soul are the only two that God created directly. But the Quran draws the line at the doctrine of incarnation and the Trinity, seeing these as innovations that blur the divine-human distinction. If you remember, the doctrine of incarnation stated that Jesus was part God, and the Trinity itself split God into three sections: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Muslims are not fond of this parental image for God because it's not proper for God to have children. To speak of human beings as God children casts God in a two-human mode, which means they want to separate the idea of God from the idea of the humans, or the idea of the material. To start casting God in human form is anthropomorphic. And what this means is we don't have the ability to conceive of the divine or conceptualize the divine, so we anchor this conceptualization into things that make sense to us. You know, we do the same thing with animals. We say a dog is smiling when his lips on the side arch up. You know, we say, oh, that looks like a smile, because we understand the concept of smiling and we apply it to the dog. When we see a cat that has a certain pattern to its eyes that makes it look like a frown, we say that cat is always angry. This is what's called anthropomorphic. And this is what Islam cannot abide by when it comes to other religions. For God is fear-inspiring awesomeness in nature. Power of this order, it is infinite. For God is omnipotent and inspires fear. So it is fair to say that Muslims fear Allah, but often with an omniscient God. That is to say, a God who knows everything. The slippery slope in logic is often determinism, because if you have a God who knows everything, the God knows what you're going to do next. If it doesn't know what you're going to do next, then it is not omniscient, because there is a part of its knowledge that is limited. So thus, God knows what you're going to do, and therefore the choice that you make is not really your choice, hence determinism. But in Allah's universe, good and evil matter, and choices have consequences, so it's not deterministic. And when they talk about the power or majesty that inspires fear, Houston Smith uses the imagery of Mount Everest. Its majesty is evident, but so are the dangers it presents. Mistakes could be disastrous. But seeing Allah as merely fear-inspiring would be a mistake, because God's compassion and mercy is cited 192 times in the Quran against the 17 references to his wrath and vengeance. There is an access to the divine, because the human and the divine may be infinitely different, but no barrier separates them in the form of experience. Is he not closer than the vein of your neck? You need not raise your voice, for he knows the secret whisper, and what is yet more hidden. He knows what is in the land and in the sea. No leaf falls, but he knows it. Nor is there a grain in the darkness under the earth, nor a thing green or sere, but it is recorded. 6:12 and 59. But the important thing to take from this section of the lecture is how the Quran's innovation is to remove idols, and how this understanding, this foundation to the Islam philosophy, this coupled with the idea that the divine is distinct from human beings, leads to the critique of the doctrine of incarnation and the Trinity, and leads us to another basic theological concept, creation. Now, when it comes to the concept of creation, the Quran states that the world was created by a deliberate act of Allah's will. He has created the heavens and the earth. Now, this comes with two consequences. One, the world of matter is both real and important. And herein lies one of the sources of the Islamic science, which during Europe's dark ages flourished as nowhere else in the world. There was a true respect for the real world, and the real world was considered important. In other religions, we can get caught up in the divine world or the immaterial world, so that this world is just a staging ground. This is something that Nietzsche would critique in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This idea that this world is not really that important because our rewards are given in the divine realm. Another consequence here is that being the handiwork of Allah, who is perfect in both goodness and power, the material world must likewise be good. You do not see in the creation of the All-Merciful any imperfection. Return your gaze, it comes back to you dazzled. Now, this is something that should be familiar, because here we meet a confidence in the material aspect of life and existence that we find shared in the two Semitically originated religions, Judaism and Christianity. Life is good, because God is good and gave you life. For Judaism, God freed them from slavery for a reason. Because God is good, thus God will not do things that are evil, malicious, or malevolent. Which is a nice segue into the human self. So in God's creation, he also created man. We read in Surah 16:3. And the first thing that we note about this creation is its sound constitution. It's made well, it's made good. Stated explicitly in the Quran, surely we have created humanity of the best stature. And to elaborate even further, the Quranic word for human nature in its God-established origin is fira, and it has been stained by no catastrophic fail. So there is no concept of original sin here. The closest Islam comes to the Christian doctrine of original sin is the concept of haltafa, or forgetting. But this is not original sin. Haltafa includes forgetting one's divine nature. It's not something we're born with. That's why they say it's the closest conception, because it involves the idea that one forgets their original creation, forgets their divine origin. And this mistake needs repeatedly to be corrected. For because of our divine origins, our fundamental nature is unalterably good. So we are entitled to a self-respect and healthy self-image. We are not born sinners. And with this comes a kind of philosophy that life can be acknowledged as a gift from its creator. And with this gift comes certain obligations. First of all, we need to be grateful for the life that has been given to us, this life that has been received. The Arabic word infidel is actually shaded more towards one who lacks thankfulness than one who disbelieves. So it's one who forgoes the first obligation that we are given this life from the Creator, that we should be grateful for this life that has been received. So showing gratitude is very important as an obligation. So then the ingrate, the Quran tells us, covers or hides God's blessing and thereby fails to enjoy the link with the Creator that every moment provides. The second obligation takes us back to the opening paragraphs of this chapter and the idea of surrender, of which Islam gets its name. But first, the connotation must be addressed. As Houston Smith states, so frightened with military connotations that it requires conscious effort to notice that surrender can mean a wholehearted giving up of oneself to a cause or in friendship and love. And what he's stating here is when we hear surrender, we hear the military term. We hear the idea of giving something up, giving something of oneself up. But it can mean a giving of oneself to a cause. One could say that in my undergraduate degree, I fell in love with philosophy and therefore surrendered myself to the life of a philosopher, to the cause of one day pursuing that ideal of philosophy and becoming a professor of philosophy. But William James shows how central this surrender is much better than I can. When all is said and done, we are in the end obviously dependent on the universe, and into sacrifices and surrenders of some sort, deliberately looked at and accepted, we are drawn and pressed as into our only permanent positions of repose. Now, in those states of mind which fall short of religion, the surrender is submitted to an imposition of necessity, and that sacrifice is undergone at the very best without complaint. In the religious life, on the contrary, surrender and sacrifice are positively espoused. Even unnecessary givings up are added in order that the happiness may increase. Religion thus makes easy and felicitous what in any case is necessary. Therefore, to be a slave to Allah is to be freed from other forms of slavery, ones that are degrading. And what they mean here is like a slavery to greed or to anxiety or to desires of personal status. This should make sense because this is the idea we see a lot in Buddhism and Hinduism, especially in Hinduism. This idea that when you're first born, seek out all the pleasure because the pleasure is empty, and therefore you'll eventually move on to higher forms of pleasure. In this sense, while you're merely seeking the pleasure world, you are a slave to those pleasures. Thus, the commitment of surrender here shows a moving towards rather than giving up. In this reading, Islam emerges as a religion that aims to total commitment in which nothing is held from the divine, which explains why Abraham is one of the most important figures in the Quran, passing the ultimate test to be willing to sacrifice his own son if it was required. This leads to two final features of the individual self that segue really well into the day of judgment, and that is the soul's individuality and freedom. Now, coming from Buddhism, where the idea is anatta, there is no self, you are connected to the world, there's no individuality. And then in Confucianism, the social self, because we are a part of the social world, we are kind of struck by the stress that the Quran places on the self's individuality. Islam and its Semitic allies regard individuality as not only real but good in principle. Value, virtue, and spiritual fulfillment come through realizing the potentials that are unique to one's own life. So life is kind of personalized. The possibilities of some differ from those of every other soul because we live different lives. All life is individual. There's no such thing as universal life. And the individuality of the human soul is everlasting. For once it is created, it never dies. But what's interesting here is never is its distinctness more acutely sensed than on the day of judgment. O son of Adam, you will die alone and enter the tomb alone and be resurrected alone. And it is within you alone that the reckoning will be made. This leads to the second final feature of the human self, which is freedom. Because it must be admitted that in Islam, human freedom stands in tension with God's omnipotence, which points towards predestination. Again, that idea of omniscience, that they know everything that an individual is going to do, and therefore nothing that they could have done could have been done from free will, because that all-powerful God knew what they were going to do. This is something that not only philosophy has wrestled with, but Islamic theology has also wrestled with. But it has concluded that the divine decree remain a mystery to humans, who nevertheless are granted sufficient freedom and responsibility to make genuine moral and spiritual decisions. Whoever goes to himself a sin gets it solely on his own responsibility. Whoever goes astray, he himself bears the whole responsibility of wandering. 4:111 and 10:103. So basically there must be freedom if one is to be punished for going astray. But that is a freedom that we will never understand. Regardless, we are still held accountable for our decisions, which leads us to the day of judgment. When the sun shall be folded up, and the stars shall fall, and when the mountains shall be set in motion, and the seas shall boil, then shall every soul know what it has done. Psalm 81. So depending upon how it fares in its reckoning, and of course we're talking about the soul here, the soul will repair to either the heavens or the hells, which in the Quran are described in vivid, concrete, and sensual imagery. In the heavens, we are treated to fountains, cool shades, and chaste houris in the gardens beneath which rivers flow. In the hells, there are burning garments, molten drinks, and maces of iron and fire that splits rocks into fragments. The sharp distinction here, or the sharp contrast between heaven and hell, is intended to pull the hearer or the reader of the Quran out of the spiritual lethargy that hawfala, or that forgetfulness, induces. So Muslims concerning the afterlife is that each soul will be held accountable for its actions on earth, with its future thereafter, depending upon how well it observed God's commands. So in this sense, the soul judges themselves. What death burns away is that self-serving defenses, forcing one to see with total objectivity how one has lived one's life. And so this idea that you'll be able to save yourself from that which you have transgressed doesn't work anymore, because that subjectivity is burnt away. You're going to see with total objectivity how you've lived one life, and therefore with objectivity judge yourself. But what's interesting to note here is how the role of punisher is removed from Allah, and Allah is removed from direct involvement. Their soul judges themselves. So that's how the day of judgment works for the Quran. But to wrap up this whole section, God, creation, the human self, and the day of judgment. These are the chief theological pegs on which the Quran's teachings hang. In spite of their importance, however, the Quran is a book which emphasizes deeds rather than ideas. It is to these deeds that we shall turn into the next section that we will definitely go over in the next lecture, for this is a good place to stop as this lecture has gone on fairly long as it is. So make sure you finish your discussion post and the quiz before Sunday at midnight. Have a great week.